Mass migration. Few topics ignite as much passion, fear, and confusion as this one. Turn on the news and you'll hear two entirely different stories. One about compassion and human rights, another about chaos and security. But what's really happening behind the noise? Why are so many people on the move? And why do governments and political parties see the same crisis so differently? In this episode of Deep Decode, we explore mass migration, from the United States to Europe, Africa, and Asia, and break down what both the left and the right often leave unsaid. Let's start in the United States, a nation built by immigrants, yet divided by immigration policy. Every year, hundreds of thousands attempt to cross the southern border, fleeing poverty, political instability, or violence in Latin America. To the left, America's migration story is about opportunity and moral responsibility. They argue that most migrants come seeking work and safety, not trouble. Progressives support creating legal pathways to citizenship, protecting dreamers under DACA, and reforming asylum laws so people aren't trapped in dangerous limbo. To the right, the border represents sovereignty. Conservatives see unchecked migration as a national security threat, one that strains social systems, floods low-wage markets, and could allow criminals or traffickers to slip through. They emphasize legal immigration, stronger border enforcement, and deportation for those who violate entry laws. Both sides are correct in parts, but both simplify the picture. Few mention that America's demand for cheap labor fuels the very system it condemns. Farmers, construction firms, and restaurants quietly depend on undocumented workers to survive. So while politicians argue about walls, the economy quietly keeps the border open in practice. Now, let's cross the Atlantic. Europe has faced its own migration crisis, particularly after the Syrian war and the conflicts in North Africa. In 2015 alone, over 1 million refugees arrived on European shores, the largest movement since World War II. To the left, Europe's humanitarian tradition was being tested. Leaders like Angela Merkel insisted that Germany, one of the world's richest nations, had a moral duty to help. For progressives, the crisis symbolized Europe's chance to prove that compassion could coexist with prosperity. But the right saw something different, a continent losing control. Populist movements in Italy, Hungary, and the United Kingdom argued that mass migration threatened Europe's identity and social stability. They linked rising crime, overcrowded housing, and unemployment to open border policies, even when evidence was mixed. As a result, the European Union fractured. Some nations welcomed migrants. Others built fences and refused quotas. The debate became less about people and more about politics. What's rarely discussed is how Europe's own foreign policy contributed to migration. Military interventions in Libya and the Middle East, and decades of resource extraction in Africa helped destabilize regions that now send migrants north. So when Europeans debate migration, they're often confronting the consequences of their own history. In regions like Africa and the Middle East, migration isn't a political choice. It's survival. Civil wars, droughts, collapsing economies, and authoritarian regimes force millions to flee. The majority never reach the West. They move within their own continents, seeking refuge in neighboring countries. For example, Uganda now hosts over 1.5 million refugees from South Sudan and the Congo. Lebanon and Jordan, small nations with fragile economies, host millions from Syria. These countries receive far less global attention, yet bear the greatest burden. When Western media covers migration, it often focuses on who arrives, not on those left wandering between borders. And then there's the climate factor. As deserts expand and coasts erode, environmental displacement is accelerating. By 2050, climate change could create more than 200 million internal migrants, according to the World Bank. No ideology, left or right, has a clear plan for that scale of movement. Asia experiences another kind of migration, economic rather than refugee-driven. Millions move from South or Southeast Asia to Gulf countries each year to work in construction, domestic labor, and manufacturing. They keep economies running yet remain invisible, bound by temporary visas, often without citizenship or basic rights. Here, the political debate is minimal, but the ethical questions are vast. These migrants don't seek asylum, they seek wages. They send billions home in remittances, propping up entire national economies like Nepal, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. Governments praise this labor flow publicly, while quietly accepting the human cost, exploitation, abuse, and the lack of long-term stability. Migration, in this context, isn't about ideology, it's about dependence. Across countries, the left's message is consistent. Migration is a human right and a shared global responsibility. They emphasize inclusion, integration, and humanitarian aid. They believe diversity strengthens societies, and that wealthy nations owe refuge to those displaced by war, poverty, or climate. The left also frames migration as an opportunity for innovation, culture, and economic growth. Data supports some of this view. Migrants are statistically more likely to start new businesses and contribute more in taxes than they receive in benefits. However, what's often left unsaid is scale. Progressive ideals sometimes underestimate how quickly social systems can adapt. When integration programs fail, tensions rise, giving fuel to populist backlash. The moral argument is sound, but the logistics often lag behind. For conservatives, migration must be controlled, selective, and lawful. They argue that compassion without order leads to instability. From the United States to Hungary, the right promotes stronger borders, tougher vetting, and merit-based systems that prioritize skills over need. Their message resonates with those who feel left behind, citizens who fear job loss, cultural erosion, or weakened national identity. But what's rarely discussed is interdependence. Even the strictest anti-migration economies rely on migrant labor. From agriculture in the US to healthcare in Europe, entire sectors depend on the very people political leaders vow to keep out. The right is correct about the need for structure, but often silent about the benefits they quietly rely on. At the international level, efforts to manage migration remain fragmented. The United Nations Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration is one of the few global frameworks. Yet it's non-binding, and many countries have refused to sign it. The European Union continues to negotiate deals with North African nations to stop migrant boats before they reach Europe. The United States funds border security in Central America. Australia operates offshore detention centers to deter asylum seekers. These policies share a theme: containment rather than solution. Governments treat migration as a crisis to be stopped, rather than a pattern to be understood. And that's the hidden truth. Mass migration isn't a temporary wave. It's the new normal of a connected, unequal, and warming world. The left speaks of compassion. The right speaks of control. But both often ignore the root causes: the wars, trade imbalances, and climate impacts that push people to move in the first place. Migration isn't just about borders. It's about systems, global supply chains, political decisions, and economic inequality. Every migrant crossing a border is responding to pressures created by global forces much larger than themselves. So when we debate migration, we're really debating how fair our world has become and how willing we are to share its consequences. Mass migration will define this century, not because people are moving, but because of how we respond. Nations can build higher walls or stronger bridges. They can treat migrants as invaders or as partners in rebuilding economies. The left and right offer different answers, both incomplete. What the world needs is not a louder argument, but a deeper understanding. Because migration isn't a crisis of movement, it's a mirror, reflecting who we are, what we value, and how far we're willing to go to protect both humanity and home. This is Deep Decode. Thanks for listening. And remember, understanding begins when we look beyond the headlines.